Now, I'm aware that Halo 5 is the middle chapter of a trilogy, and therefore it has to set up its final chapter, but this cliffhanger was bad even by cliffhanger standards. And what makes it so bad doesn't really have much to do with the ending itself, nor the fact that it was a cliffhanger. The reason this cliffhanger doesn't work is because nothing really happens in Halo 5, and it fails to tell a complete, or at the very least, a satisfying story. I mean, things happened, but it was all busy work and did little to progress the plot. To demonstrate this, I'm going to tackle two primary examples. One is a comparative summarization of two different Halo games, and the second is a literary principle called Todorov's narrative theory. We'll start with Todorov's theory first. Essentially, Todorov states that most narratives follow the same narrative configuration. 1. Equilibrium, 2. Disruption, 3. Recognition, 4. Repair, 5. Equilibrium. The idea is that the story starts in a place of equilibrium, where everything is fine and the characters are living as normal. Then a disruption occurs which forces the characters out of their routine. The characters acknowledge the disruption and then seek out a way to repair the situation. The situation is finally resolved and they settle back into their state of equilibrium. Now, this is obviously not a hard and fast rule that everyone must abide in order to tell a good story, as there are plenty of great stories that don't follow this exact pattern. I don't bring this up to demonstrate the fact that Halo 5 doesn't abide by this pattern, but the fact that Halo 5 does abide by it, but only makes it 2/3 of the way through the cycle. Let's break it down. Halo 5 starts with Blue Team performing a routine mission, one of dozens as indicated by Fred. This is the equilibrium. Cortana starts summoning the Guardians, taking countless innocent lives. She also contacts the Chief, instructing him to come and find her. This is the disruption. Chief learns that Cortana is responsible for awakening the Guardians. This is the recognition of the disruption. Chief then attempts to stop Cortana, but fails. Roll credits. This is the repair. Wait a minute, what? Halo 5 fails to tell a complete story arc. It's the first and second act of a 3-act structure. Because of this, there is no resolution and barely any progress. It's simply an incomplete piece of storytelling. Because of this, it ends up being mostly filler and wholly unsatisfying by the end. Halo 2, another game in the franchise lambasted for its cliffhanger ending, makes it through the complete arc, at least for the most part. The Master Chief has returned to Earth and is summoned to an award ceremony. Equilibrium. The Covenant attack Earth and Chief follow them to another Halo ring. Disruption. Chief learns that the Prophets intend on activating the rings. Recognition. Chief and the Arbiter join forces against the Covenant and through their actions stop Tartarus from activating the Halo rings, and Chief hitches a ride on Truth's ship. Repair. Roll credits. The only step not attained is the second equilibrium, but technically for there to be a cliffhanger ending, there almost by definition needs to be an incomplete arc. Now, I feel like we could end up getting caught in the semantics here when discussing this specific topic, but you don't need to tell a complete arc to tell a compelling story, and the arc doesn't have to exist only once. You can have multiple arcs running in tandem or sequentially in a story, and if you are planning on telling multiple stories within a franchise, i.e. multiple entries or sequels, then you need to have an overall arc that contains all of the arcs told within the franchise. Halo 2 tells its own arc, sans the equilibrium, while continuing the franchise arc of the Covenant's war with humanity and attempts to start their great journey. Again, Halo 2 isn't perfect, otherwise no one would have had a problem with the ending. My point here is that Halo 5's cliffhanger is even less compelling and earned than Halo 2, and that should say something considering how notorious Halo 2's ending is. Now, with all that being said, one could argue that Halo 5 could have been fine stopping at step 4 of Todorov's theory had the story been satisfying up until that point. But unfortunately, by the opinion of the majority of the Halo community, it wasn't. And here's a good example why. Here is everything that happened in Halo 5's story. Cortana summons the Guardians, taking thousands of innocent lives. Chief is contacted by Cortana and he goes AWOL to find her. Oni sends out a team to bring Chief back. Osiris land on Sunaion and get the Arbiter's help to board a Guardian. Osiris attempts to rendezvous with Blue Team but are unsuccessful. Chief finds Cortana and attempts to talk her down, but are also unsuccessful and then locked in a cryptum. Cortana sends the Guardians back out into space to begin enforcing her galactic rule. Chief is rescued by Fireteam Osiris. Roll credits. This game is a slow burn for its entirety, and just as soon as it starts to pick up pace and become interesting, the game ends. This game even managed to give my ex-girlfriend blue balls. The entirety of Halo 5 would have been the first 2 acts of anything else, yet here it is as all 3 acts. To demonstrate how little was accomplished in this game, let's compare it to the same studio's previous entry in this franchise, Halo 4. 4, which, fun fact, actually does complete Todorov's full arc. Chief is awoken from cryosleep by a Covenant attack. Chief is pulled into a new Forerunner world by a gravity well. Cortana reveals that she is going rampant. Chief commits to get back to Earth to save Cortana. Chief is tricked into releasing an ancient Forerunner threat, the Didact. The only ship Chief can take back home, the Infinity, crash lands on the same Forerunner world. Chief rendezvous with the Infinity and construct a plan to return home. Chief meets the Librarian, who informs him of the Forerunner's past and grants him immunity to the Composer. Chief destroys the gravity well so that the Infinity can escape. Chief stays on Requiem to stop the Didact. Chief follows the Didact to the Composer, a machine that can end all life on Earth. The Didact retrieves the Composer and begins using it on Earth. Chief boards the Didact's ship in order to destroy it and stop the Didact. Chief sets off a nuke and blows up the Didact's ship and the Composer. Cortana uses what is left of herself to save the Chief and then dies. The Chief is rescued from space. Do you see the difference here? Halo 4 follows a complete arc with a ton of things happening throughout, and even ended conclusively after all of that. Halo 5 doesn't even have a third of what happened in Halo 4, yet ends with a cliffhanger anyway. When your entire game could be boiled down to a few cutscenes in Halo 6, you know you didn't deliver the goods. There is a common principle in writing called Chekhov's gun. The idea behind this principle comes from the statements of Anton Chekhov and is essentially as follows. Remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, then in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. Now, I've heard people argue semantics that maybe the gun is just decoration, and those people are clearly missing the point. The idea is to trim the fat and keep the meat. Don't fill your story with useless dialogue, character, or actions. Get to the point and progress the story. Like a good cut of meat, some fat here and there can be a great thing, but it's a very fine line, and you have to be careful as to not bog down the story with too much fat, yet keep just enough so that the story doesn't feel surgical in execution. After my breakdown of how little was accomplished in Halo 5, I think you can see where I'm going with this. Halo 5 is mostly fat, 25% substance, 75% filler, and is absolutely teeming with useless characters and scenarios. To illustrate my point, I want to ask you a question. If you removed Vale, Tanaka, Buck, Fred, Kelly, and Linda, how would this affect Halo 5's story as a whole? How would their removal affect the overall plot or your enjoyment of the game? Sure, there would be some missing dialogue, some cutscenes would need to be reworked, and combat encounters would need to be adjusted, but would the overall outcome change? Would their removal change the story in any meaningful way? Would your enjoyment of the game be lessened by their absence? What about with Spartan Palmer, or the Arbiter, or Julim Dama, or Halsey, or the Warden Eternal? Now, while some of you may find this comparison unfair, compare this to a story like The Last of Us. Ask those same questions of Marlene, or Ellie, or Tess, or David, Sarah, or Bill, or Sam, or Henry. If you removed any of those characters, that story changes dramatically. The only character integral to the plot of Halo 5 is Cortana. Even Chief is a useless character in this game. To prove this, let's do a little theory crafting. In Halo 5, the plot is that Cortana survived and is awakening the Guardians to enforce a galactic peace. By the end of the story, she escapes and begins her galactic rule. If you remove Osiris, does she still succeed? Yes. If you remove Blue Team, does she still succeed? Yes, she does. If you remove Halsey, Lasky, Palmer, the Arbiter, or Julim Dama, does she still succeed? Of course she does. The only thing that potentially changes is whether or not the Arbiter defends Sunayon, but even that we can't say for sure, and it doesn't matter because we have no idea what saving the Arbiter or Sunayon means. The game ends before any ramifications occur from that event. Okay, fine, so the characters have no impact on the outcome of the story. That's great, but maybe they add to the game in other ways. An interesting dynamic, or side story, or simply add some entertainment value or humor and levity to the game. While I'm sure some of you out there will disagree, in my opinion, they really don't. Sure, Buck has an occasional funny line, and maybe some people find Vale's ability to speak Sangheili interesting, but none of it makes up for how divided and flat their inclusion is. There are no memorable characters in Halo 5 for me, aside from Exuberant Witness, which is admittedly a great character. But outside of that, every other character is flat and uninteresting. Even Cortana, who used to be one of my favorite characters in the Halo franchise, is just plain awful in Halo 5 in my opinion. While writing this script, and after having played Halo 5 well over 4 times from beginning to end, I still found myself having to look up the names of several members of Osiris and Blue Team. I even forgot the name of that robot in the green armor. Okay, obviously that last part was a joke, but the previous statements weren't. These characters are so underdeveloped and lacking personality that I honestly forgot who was who on more than one occasion. I've even mixed them up in this script and had to correct it after the fact in the edit. Halo 5 needed a much more focused story with far fewer characters. That way the characters that were included would have time to breathe and develop. Halo 5 is a prime example of too many cooks spoiling the broth. There are too many characters and not enough time to develop them or make them distinct or interesting. And while I really do appreciate the ambition that 343 have for pushing the envelope, I also have to be realistic and admit that it just simply didn't work. Now, I know that I've brought this up multiple times throughout this video, and at the risk of becoming redundant, I feel like I need to touch on it again. Halo 5 honestly shows very, very little, and what it shows half the time isn't important to the plot. Aspects that are critical to the story of Halo 5 are mentioned in passing or over the radio, while aspects that do little in developing the story get giant spotlights. A prime example of this is Cortana's reveal and resurrection. Arguably the most important part of Halo 5's story is done off-screen and through an unceremonious radio call. Fireteam Osiris punching rocks and kicking vehicles, on the other hand. Epic pre-rendered cutscene! There are dozens of examples of this throughout Halo 5. The formation of Osiris. That happens off-screen. Who are they? How are they? Why are they? Who cares? Just go get Halsey and punch some elites. The time they spent on that flashy intro action scene could have been spent on a scene showing the formation of the squad, having them introduce themselves to each other, giving a plausible exposition dump for the audience because, just like the characters, everyone would be meeting for the first time. Imagine having a cutscene that introduces these characters to one another, but before they have any real chance of getting to know each other, they are summoned and sent off on a mission. During that first mission, there is scattered dialogue of them asking questions, getting to know each other, and joking around, allowing these characters to develop a rapport alongside the player. But no, instead we got this. Or how about the formation of Blue Team? How are they alive? Where have they been? How have they been? Why are they together now? How did they become family? Stop asking questions and watch them abandon their post for Chief's malfunctioning AI. Similarly to Osiris, we should have, as the players, been there when Blue Team were reunited, or at the very least had some sort of cutscene establishing these characters, their history, and their dynamic. And I mean more than the few lines of dialogue we got at the beginning of Mission 2. I know these aren't perfect solutions, and sitting through long cutscenes to force a connection and understanding of a character isn't the best way to handle it, but these are just patchwork suggestions for a much bigger problem rooted to the core of this game. To throw 7 new characters into a game, all of which are primary characters, is nearly impossible to do satisfactorily in a single game, especially one of this length. It's far too much to cover in far too little time. But if you're going to do that, you have to do everything you can to give the audience the context and the history. Otherwise, you end up with 7 new faces you barely form a bond with. When all is said and done, you can't tell a player to care about or grow attached to a character. You have to show them firsthand why they should. Jules' rise to Covenant leader, the disillusion of the Covenant after his death, the Arbiter's return to and war over Sanghelios, the history of Blue Team, the aforementioned formation of Blue Team, Osiris, and the resurrection of Cortana are all just touched on via dialogue exposition. And these are just a few that I can remember off the top of my head. Things this important absolutely need to be shown and experienced by the player, not solely delivered via expository dialogue. There is a lot wrong with the characters in Halo 5, and I truly don't understand the design choice they went with the Master Chief in this game. In order to illustrate my point, I have to cover some literary terms beforehand. So, when looking at characters in a story, there are essentially 4 types of characters you can have. You can have either a static character or a dynamic character, and of those, they can either be one-dimensional or three-dimensional. A static character is one whose personality never changes. They are the exact same character at the beginning of the story as they are at the end. Think the Master Chief from Halo Combat Evolved or Marcus Phoenix from Gears of War 1. A dynamic character is one that changes over the course of the story. Think Ellie from The Last of Us or Lara Croft from Tomb Raider 2012. A one-dimensional character is one with a single notable character trait, also known as a flat character. A good example of this would be Sergeant Johnson from Halo 2. A three-dimensional character is one with many notable character traits, also known as a round character. Think Elizabeth from BioShock Infinite. A character could be static and one-dimensional, or it could be static and three-dimensional. The same applies to dynamic characters. I bring this up because in order to demonstrate my point, I will be using these terms to convey what I mean. First and foremost, and one of my biggest complaints with all of the characters in Halo 5, not just Chief and Cortana, is that every single character in Halo 5 is a static character. One could argue that Cortana changes in the last act of the game, but I disagree. I think she had always been that way throughout Halo 5, but we only ever saw the maternal and manipulative side of her as Chief, and the bratty and sarcastic side when playing as Osiris at the end. Couple the static characters with the fact that almost every single character in Halo 5 is one-dimensional, and you are left with some pretty boring characters. Buck is static and flat, the sarcastic hotshot. Locke is also static and flat, the by-the-books hardass. Vale and Tanaka are both static and flat, and honestly, they're really not all that different from each other in terms of personality. Backstory, sure, but demonstrable personality? Not really. Fred is flat and static, the stoic skeptic. Kelly and Linda fall into the same trap that Vale and Tanaka did, where they are both flat and static, but again, had such little to differentiate them in terms of personality that they simply blend together. Palmer is the serious tactician, Lasky the empathetic commander, and Halsey the mentally unhinged warrior, all of which are static and flat. And don't even get me started on the Warden Eternal. Now, I know there are glimpses occasionally where these characters dip their toes into the pool of dynamic or three-dimensional characters, most notably Buck, but they never go any further than that, and ultimately end up settling in as flat, static characters. I'm not trying to insinuate that flat or static characters are a bad thing, as they can be great. Sergeant Johnson is a great example, but when that is all that you have in your game, and none of them have particularly compelling or interesting single personality traits, it definitely starts to become an issue. But more damning than the issues with the new and side characters are the changes they made to Cortana and the Master Chief. In Halos 1 through 3, Cortana was a dynamic, three-dimensional character. Master Chief was a static, one-dimensional character. They were the opposites of each other, spanning the character spectrum in just 2 characters. And while they weren't the best characters in all of video games, they served their purpose, and they did so admirably. This dynamic changed a bit with Halo 4. In Halo 4, Cortana stayed a dynamic three-dimensional character, but opened up even more and showed more character and depth. The biggest change, however, was with the Master Chief. He changed from a static, one-dimensional character into a dynamic 2.5-dimensional character. This change was a surprising development for this character, but in the best possible way, in my opinion. As I'll dive into a little bit later, I loved the dynamic that developed in Halo 4 when it came to the Chief and Cortana. The personal story of love and loss between those two characters was such a significant departure from what I had come to know from a Halo game, and for me, it absolutely worked. This is again something I will touch on a bit later, so I won't go into too much depth here, but the characters of Cortana and Master Chief in Halo 4 were the best the characters had gotten in the franchise up to that point, in my opinion. And with how Halo 4 had ended, the possibilities and implications this had for the Master Chief going forward were so compelling. Imagine my disappointment when the Master Chief we got in Halo 5 was the most static, one-dimensional and dull version of this character we have ever gotten up to this point. I mean, what happened? In Halo 4, 343 took a huge step forward with this character, only to take 2 giant steps back in Halo 5. Chief went from a static, flat character with a sense of humor to a round, dynamic character, and then back to a flat, static character, but this time with even less personality. He went from developed to devolved over the course of one game to another, and I just don't understand that decision. I understand the idea of exploring Chief as the ultimate machine after losing Cortana, especially after establishing the machine motif back in Halo 4, but the problem is they didn't really execute on this idea in Halo 5. They just removed his charisma and replaced it with hissy fits. If they wanted to explore this machine motif, then they should have actually made him a machine. No emotional fits, no lashing out, just pure, concentrated focus. And then, when Cortana's return is revealed to him, that should have lit the spark of life back into the Chief. Imagine this. The game starts and it is clear that the Master Chief is essentially emotionally dead. He gets his orders from command and executes on them without comment. He is simply a tool doing its job. Certain characters try engaging in conversation with him, exactly like the Lasky scene at the end of Halo 4, and Chief's responses are simple, one-word replies. Chief, as a person, is dead. No quippy one-liners, no form of personality, nothing. Your first mission is Chief being sent off alone, I'll cover this later, to recover that Oni research facility. Throughout all of the cutscenes you have seen of him since the start of the game, he has moved deliberately and at a determined pace. At the end of the mission, Chief has secured the station and calls into command to tell them that they can send in the recovery team. Command says they don't need the station returned, they just need the data stored there. Chief starts skimming through the files on a computer terminal where something catches his eye. Instead of being contacted by Cortana through a hallucinatory vision, he discovers some intel implying she is still alive and has plans for something on Meridian. This cutscene could play out where a recording or some sort of video log plays in front of him, and the camera slowly pans in towards his visor. Chief suddenly bursts to life, darting towards the computer console and downloading the file. He bolts to the nearby server and quickly pulls out the hard drive and radios into command. He tells them that he has their data and needs personal transportation to Meridian. He speaks fast, clearly. All the while, he is full-on sprinting for the exit. Do you see what I'm getting at here? This would play into that character plot perfectly. This premise was already established in Halo 4, and Halo 5 fails to continue on with it. The Chief we have in Halo 5 is the same dull, bland character in the very last cutscene that he was at the very first. If they would have established him as a machine after the death of Cortana in the beginning, but then resurrected his personality with the resurrection of Cortana, that would have been a great character arc and really shown how dependent he is on her when it comes to being human. A major missed opportunity here, in my opinion. And then there is Cortana. It's hard to express in words how upsetting and disappointing the character of Cortana in Halo 5 is to me. They managed to take my favorite character in the Halo franchise and turn her into one of my least favorite characters in video games as a whole. While making her a villain will always be a tough pill to swallow, the villain part isn't the part I hate the most. It's the downgrade in her character and personality. Cortana in Halo 5 has none of the qualities I enjoyed about her in the previous entries in this franchise. Cortana used to be sweet, smart, funny, and full of personality. The Cortana in Halo 5 is a slimy, manipulative, patronizing, and bratty tyrant. And if that's what 343 were going for, they nailed it. Unfortunately, what they were going for was a terribly unlikable character, which isn't what you want in a character. I know she's supposed to be the villain, but you can make a likable villain. Just look at Batman's Joker or Borderlands' Handsome Jack. Cortana isn't a likable villain. She's actually quite the opposite. And I think that's the biggest shame of them all. We'll be touching on this topic again here in a few minutes. I'm just gonna be blunt and say that I'm not a fan of Fireteam Osiris, as if that wasn't abundantly obvious at this point. My distaste for Osiris is for a number of reasons, but I want to make something very clear. I don't mind Osiris as a concept. Actually, I find their addition could be very compelling if handled correctly. As you'll see when I get into my rewrite of the Halo 5 story, I opt to keep Osiris in the game, which may come as a surprise to a lot of you. The caveat is that their implementation is far different from how it was handled in Halo 5, but we'll get to that later. Look, I understand that it's called Halo and not Master Chief Simulator, but after what happened in Halo 4, I imagine most players, myself included, wanted to see what the death of Cortana meant to him as a character. To then jump into Halo 5 only to spend 3/4 of the game in someone else's shoes, a someone who, might I add, the player has never even heard of outside of the expanded lore, simply robs them of that experience. We never got to experience what the death of Cortana meant for the Chief, as we barely even see him, let alone play as him. And even when we do, we find that the game doesn't even touch on that particular issue anyway. I am honestly incredibly curious as to how this went down internally at 343. It's almost as if someone said, let's take the Master Chief, take one of the few people that he's ever truly cared about, kill them off in front of his eyes, and then have the players take control of a completely different protagonist in the next game, and never explore what that meant for the Chief as a character. This is obviously hyperbolic and far from their actual intentions, but it's unfortunately how it ended up appearing. Halo players care about the Master Chief, and after what happened in Halo 4, they have an even stronger investment in Chief and a continued desire to see the world through his eyes, to experience how he deals with loss and what it means for him as a character. But setting that aside, even if players did want to jump into someone else's shoes, I imagine they'd want someone far more interesting than Spartan Locke, a hard-ass, characterless, by-the-books lapdog that works for the military. Chief was far from the most personality-driven character in the first 3 Halo games, but even with his extremely limited dialogue, he still had some charm and personality to him.
No thanks to your driving, yes. Don't get any funny ideas. Something tells me I'm not gonna like this.
But... Oh, I see. The coordinate data needs to be... Right. Sorry. Pull up! Pull up! You did that on purpose, didn't you? Not much. A well-placed grenade, perhaps, but why... Okay, I'm coming with you.
But it seems I was mistaken.
That's a first.
Got an escape plan?
Thought I'd try shooting my way out. Mix things up a little.
We could always ask nicely.
Asking's not my strong suit.
I don't suppose you're any good at clearing LZs.
On occasion.
He was likable, funny, and you always wanted to see what he'd say or do next. Now let's take a look at Locke's greatest hits.
What do you think that's about?
Do you see the difference? And this leads me to my biggest problem with Osiris's characters. They just aren't that interesting. Even Buck, who is voiced by Nathan Fillion and was one of the best parts of Halo 3 ODST, is a pretty boring throwaway character in Halo 5. They managed to take one of the best characters from a previous game and turn him into a pretty boring and unremarkable character in this one. An unfortunate trend in Halo 5. Osiris simply didn't have the depth or personality to take over the reins of this franchise. But even if Fireteam Osiris was the most interesting combination of characters ever placed in a video game, I don't think that would have solved the problem. We are still left with the fact that players wanted to see how the aftermath of Halo 4 panned out and what that meant for Chief. Halo 5 feels like a complete non sequitur in the wake of Halo 4's plot. What's more is that all the trailers and advertising for this game had depicted that the Master Chief had gone rogue and that this new character, Locke, was sent to hunt him down. As demonstrated in my campaign critique, this was only technically true and barely representative of what actually unfolds in the game. Again, what's wrong with Fireteam Osiris isn't them as a concept. It is the execution of that concept. Putting that to the side, the other reason that this premise failed is because the reason for Osiris and their mission isn't believable, neither intrinsically or extrinsically. As stated many times before, the idea of Chief turned traitor isn't believable to the characters in the universe and isn't believable to the players experiencing the universe from without. No one within the game would believe this claim, and no one playing the game would believe it either. Twists, while intentionally subversive, have to make sense in the context of the universe or the characters they affect. The twist of the Master Chief turned traitor simply never landed for me or anyone I've ever talked about the subject with. It always felt like a contrived narrative device forced into the story for the sake of character conflict. So not only was the marketing fairly inaccurate to what would actually unfold in the game. Even if it were accurate, most players would have seen through the guise anyway. It's clear that whoever was in charge of the marketing of Halo 5 either missed the mark on the story that was being told, or more likely, added the hunt the chief to the game specifically to mislead the player's expectation of the narrative so that the big reveal that Cortana is alive and the crux of the story would be more surprising to the player. This decision is pretty self-defeating though, as Cortana is revealed to be alive within the second mission of the game, and then presumed to be the culprit behind the Guardian's awakening by the end of the third. Not only was this decision self-defeating, it likely contributed to the overall distaste amongst the community for the story as a whole, as it created two groups that most players fell into. Either they were excited by the prospect of hunting down the newly rogue Master Chief over ethical and moral differences, and were thus let down upon playing the game, or they had no interest in the plot between Master Chief and Locke, and solely wanted to continue the story of Master Chief and Cortana. Neither side got what they wanted, and thus the majority was let down by the story. At the end of the day, I think having a numbered entry in the franchise, especially one following the wake of Halo 4, revolve around a new group of characters simply wasn't the right choice. I can't help but be reminded of the reception of playing as the Arbiter in Halo 2. Even back then, when players had only been the Chief for a single game prior, and hadn't had a game-changing loss of a character at the end of the previous game, there was a pretty large split in the community over whether the addition of dividing the game between the Master Chief and the Arbiter was a positive or negative decision. Don't get me wrong, I don't despise the Arbiter sections of Halo 2 like some do. While I do think they are largely the weakest missions in the campaign, specifically the Heretic missions, that isn't necessarily because of who you were playing, but more about the design of the missions themselves. Playing as the Arbiter offered an interesting perspective on an enemy you've spent most of your time blasting to bits. Nevertheless, it's clear that decisions like these tend to split communities, so it shouldn't be any surprise that the same occurred with Halo 5. The root of so many of Halo 5's problems comes down to the fact that this story is simply overcomplicated. Too many threads following too many characters following too much backstory. If you are someone who only plays the games, you are without a doubt going to miss half of what is going on in this game. Not only because it relies far too heavily on expanded universe lore, but even if it were all self-contained, there are just too many balls in the air to keep track of. 8 main characters, multiple antagonists, half a dozen side characters, and a plot that interweaves a war between 3 sets of aliens, an ancient race, an artificial AI, 2 squads of strangers, and a personal story between 2 longtime partners. All of this in a campaign that can be beaten in around 8 hours. Games with this amount of story need to be 40 hours plus in order to convey that story effectively. This is just far too much for a campaign of this size. Halo's previous have successful stories because they are simple and easy to follow on the surface, but have a ton of meat under the skin for those who want to dig deeper. Halo 5 forgets what made its predecessors so good, and instead throws 100 ingredients into a mix that only needed 5 or 6. To demonstrate another example of how this overcomplication detracts from the experience, let's talk about the Covenant in Halo 5. As stated before, I will be delving into this example solely from what is presented within the games, no expanded lore. In Halo 1, the Covenant have been engaged in a war with humanity for some time. The Covenant are led by their prophets. In Halo 2, the Covenant are in a civil war over the changing of the guards from the elites to the brutes. By the end of Halo 3, the prophets are dead and the Covenant has formed a truce with humanity. In Halo 4, you are attacked by the Covenant and Cortana says that it must be a splinter group who didn't get the memo. Starting to stretch things a bit here, but fine. In Halo 5, the Covenant are reunited under the reign of Julam Dama and are apparently hostile towards humanity again, demonstrated by them firing on Fireteam Osiris. Wait, what? Weren't the Covenant in a truce with humanity? Wouldn't shooting at Spartans jeopardize that truce? Or if they had ended the truce with humanity, why did they? When did this happen? Or is this yet another splinter group? What did Jules say to convince the rest of the Covenant to hate humanity again? What is his objective? Is he trying to ignite the Halo rings again? If he is trying to light the rings, why are the Covenant back on board with the Great Journey? Weren't they enlightened to the truth back in Halo 3? Who even is Julam Dama? How did he rise to power? power. Wait, Jewel dies within the first 15 minutes of Halo 5. And if he is their new leader, why are the Covenant still attacking St. Helios later in the game? Do they have a new leader? Or are they running autonomously? Who is their new leader? What is their objective? Is it the same as Jules? What was Jules? Is anyone following any of this at all? I know that some of these questions were answered in Spartan Ops back in Halo 4, but due to the aforementioned 1/3 of a year wait time on Spartan Ops, I suspect a large portion of the Halo community never experienced that story. Do you see where I'm coming from here? This whole aspect just involving the Covenant is overly complicated and underexplained, and it is only a small portion of the overall story of Halo 5. Who the Covenant were, who their leaders were, what the Covenant were doing, and why they were doing it were all simple and crystal clear in the original trilogy. Halo 4 muddied the water with the splinter groups, and Halo 5 took that muddied water, added blood, spaghetti, and squid ink, and then told you to decipher it via touch using someone else's hands. I honestly couldn't tell you why the Covenant did anything they did in Halo 5, other than the fact that they were in the game because Halo needs its iconic antagonists. It's an overcomplicated mess and needed to be concentrated and condensed into a logical and easy to follow narrative. A player, especially someone who delved as deeply as I have, should not be this lost when it comes to your story. Quick editor's note, this section is still covering Cortana sans the logic plague theory. Don't you worry, I'm still gonna get to that, but for the time being, this was written pre-logic plague, and are thus the original questions I was asking after completing Halo 5. Up through Halo 4, Cortana was a fantastic video game character. I, for one, being a longtime fan of the Halo franchise, have grown attached to this little blue or sometimes purple AI companion. She's smart yet funny, calculated yet emotional, strong yet cautious. She was your trustworthy sidekick, always there for you, ready to help you anytime you needed her. Her death at the end of Halo 4 was devastating to us as the player, as well as her longtime partner, the Master Chief. Her inevitable return in Halo 5 was all but guaranteed, the only uncertainty being the means of her return. Would Master Chief find what remains of her code and take it to Halsey to be repaired? Would Halsey simply create another and impart Cortana's old memories onto the new AI unit? Would Master Chief take her code to a Forerunner facility, using the technology there to resurrect his AI pal? Turns out, none of the above, with a partial bit of the third. Cortana was saved after the Didact ship entered slipspace at the end of Halo 4, which happened to miraculously take her to the only place in the galaxy that could cure her. The Domain, a Forerunner network that spans the known galaxy, and is also a water of life for AIs, has somehow cured Cortana, although maybe cured isn't the right vernacular. Ignoring the fact that this is about the most coincidental of a coincidence that is ever coincidentally coincidenced, or how she managed to enter anything as broken code inside of an exploding alien spaceship, from the moment she first speaks, it is apparent that something about her is off. For one, she next to never calls him Chief, even though that is almost exclusively how she's referred to him in all past Halo games. She now insists on referring to him as John. While this is Master Chief's real name, it is uncharacteristic of her or anyone to refer to him as anything other than his Master Chief designation. In addition, there's also something about her cadence, the way she speaks, the words she uses, and the inflections in her voice. It's simply unsettling. While she may be Cortana in terms of name and voice, it's clear that this isn't quite the Cortana you used to know. Now, it's safe to assume that this was a deliberate decision on the part of 343. They clearly want the player questioning whether or not they can trust this newly resurrected Cortana, or if she is a corrupted version that was manipulated and changed by something, possibly the Forerunner technology that brought her back to life. Whether or not you like this decision is purely subjective, meaning that there really isn't a right or wrong answer. What it does mean, however, is that some will enjoy it and others won't. On one hand, you have what could be interpreted as an interesting character conflict, almost a Saren-style character arc from Mass Effect, where he is unknowingly unknowingly corrupted, unknowingly controlled, with someone else or something else influencing his thoughts behind his back. If this is, as it seems to be insinuated, what is happening to Cortana, then an argument could be made that this is an interesting character development for the story. A good character unwittingly turned bad, and how the protagonist, especially one with such strong feelings for the antagonist, deals with a situation like this. My problem with this isn't the premise itself, it's that it raises more questions than it answers. Other than the many questions posed by the plausibility of the MacGuffin device that brought Cortana back from the dead, come many, many more. Why does the domain cure AIs? Why does the domain seem to change or corrupt the AIs that it cures? What is the end goal of said corruption? Did the Warden Eternal corrupt Cortana? If so, for what purpose? If the Warden Eternal did corrupt Cortana, what does he get out of enforcing a galactic peace? If it's not the Warden, but the domain corrupting Cortana, what does the domain get out of enforcing galactic peace? Is this the real Cortana? Or a rebirth of a new Cortana shaped in the image of the domain? Would the domain corrupt all AIs? Or was it only able to manipulate Cortana due to her broken and near-death state? Have I asked enough questions at this point? The alternative is that the domain simply halts the deterioration of rampancy, and that the Cortana you encounter through Halo 5 is just a broken fraction of what Cortana used to be. I do not believe that the Cortana that existed pre-rampancy would have made the choices that Cortana post-rampancy does. Even though the morality question posed in Halo 5 is decidedly gray, it is still a forced Imperial peace, not a voluntary and, for lack of a better term, peaceful peace. And as it was implied towards the end of Halo 5, many, many innocents will die by Cortana's hand. And I believe that pre-rampancy Cortana would be too conscionable to deal with that blood on her hands. Not only is this a darker morality than I think Cortana could accept, but is also a role I'm not sure pre-rampancy Cortana would want to take. Maybe I'm projecting here, or this is just wishful thinking, but Cortana seemed happy enough joining Master Chief on his missions, assisting him in combat and helping him save the universe. There were many times that they were separated throughout the Halo series, insinuating her predilection towards the greater good, yet every time they always found a way back to each other. It is a gray area, and I understand the argument that because Cortana has the inclination to save the universe, that she may be sacrificing her own happiness and the lives of the few to save the many. Perhaps she has calculated the numbers and believes that this is the galaxy's best chance for survival. And while that is possible, I just can't fully buy into it based on Cortana's personality from the first 4 games. She is an emotional being, despite being quite literally a machine. She uses logic, but often resigns herself to her emotions. I don't think her logical side would win when it came down to the guilt she would feel after taking the lives of so many innocents. A standard machine could easily shake off the morality of sacrificing the few to save the many, but Cortana isn't, or at least wasn't, a standard machine. On the other hand, there is evidence to the contrary. Her stance on retrieving Key's neural implants, her dialogue at the end of Halo 1, staying behind to detonate in Amberclad's fusion reactor, etc., do lend credence to the notion that Cortana would sacrifice anything for the greater good. So maybe she would. The problem is that it isn't clear one way or the other. Where 343 needed to use clarity, they instead went with ambiguity, and it muddied the characters and the story. At the end of the day, it's simply impossible to know who or what the Cortana in Halo 5 is. And that is one of my biggest problems with her story arc. 343 left her too ambiguous. It's clear that their goal was to leave an amount of uncertainty with the player, but they overextended in my opinion. Instead of being intrigued and left wanting, I found myself confused, baffled by the odd character decisions and portrayal. After sitting down and writing all of this out, I find myself with a better understanding of what 343 were trying to achieve with this character, but unfortunately, my first several playthroughs left me with a bitter taste in my mouth, and that taste has persisted through my analysis. It's a fine line that needs to be walked when trying to leave your players or audience with just enough to keep them enticed, but without giving everything away and ruining the build-up. Give them too much and the player figures out the twist and lose the impact of the eventual revelation, but give them too little and they become lost, confused, and frustrated, and have a very difficult time following the story or the characters. I think that 343 unfortunately missed the mark with Cortana, leaving too much unclear for the player, allowing many, like myself, to become frustrated with the character and her direction, and that leaves an awful taste that lingers. I have a question. What was the point of killing off Cortana in Halo 4? No, seriously, what was the point? Before playing Halo 5, I would have said to grow the Master Chief as a character and allow us to explore who he is and how he deals with loss. That premise is incredibly compelling to me and made me so excited about the potential that Halo 5 had to offer. After completing Halo 5 and discovering that that is not at all what Halo 5 is about, I do not understand what the point was. They killed her off only to have her return, which could have been fine if her return was the crux of the story and culminated in the glorious reunion of Chief and his partner. But that's not what we got. There is no character development, no insight into the Chief, no exploration of his personality or any themes. Cortana's death is completely inconsequential to the plot or characters of Halo 5. Cortana could have been simply left behind or misplaced, and the story of Halo 5 would have been exactly the same. If the point was to turn Cortana evil, then I don't believe that killing her off was necessary. If anything, killing her beforehand just makes her transition far more difficult, as now you have to bring her back to life before turning her evil. Killing her off first is a needless complication that muddles the narrative and forces an unbelievable Deus Ex Machina in order to bring her back from the dead. If the whole goal was to make her the antagonist from the start, like is stated by Frank O'Connor and Brian Reed in this video, then killing her off in Halo 4 was completely unnecessary. They could have avoided this entire situation by having Chief be forced to leave her behind on Requiem in Halo 4. Maybe in order to stop the Didact, she needed to stay behind to access the Forerunner technology and allow the Master Chief to slip onto the Didact ship. Or maybe there's a locked door that she can open from inside the Forerunner facility, but can only keep it open so long as she is in the system, locking her inside. I know that leaving her behind like this is kinda cheap and essentially a retread of Halo 2, but for the sake of the argument, let's say this is what 343 went with. By leaving her behind, this would allow for a heart-wrenching goodbye between her and the Chief. As with her rapidly deteriorating condition, he would know that he wouldn't be able to return in time to save her. This would allow for an emotional scene similar to her death, still hitting that heart-wrenching note, but still allow the plausibility of what comes next. Cortana is now left alone, interfaced to a Forerunner world where she could learn about Genesis, the domain, and the chance at curing her rampancy. From there, she could make her way into the domain, either through the technology she is already interfaced with, or by reprogramming a Sentinel to take her where she can gain access. Now she still ends up in the domain, but without the need to kill her and Deus Ex Machina her back into existence. Again, far from a perfect plot, but a much more believable one, at least for me, especially considering I'm just spitballing ideas at this point. Look, I'm not saying that Cortana shouldn't have died in Halo 4. Honestly, I thought the fact that she did took major balls on the part of 343, and that it was a beautifully heart-wrenching way to end that game. My problem is that her return immediately in Halo 5 only to be the villain completely negates the beautiful end of Halo 4. If they wanted to kill her off as an emotional story beat, then they should have stuck to their guns and killed her off. Or at the very least, made the entire plot of Halo 5 Chief raising hell to bring her back. But if the point was to get her where she is at the end of Halo 5, then killing her off was unnecessary. As I've said before, I don't really know if there is a right way to make Cortana a villain, but in my opinion, the way it was handled in Halo 5 was not it. Alright, we're finally here. The logic plague. I left this until the end because I wanted to keep my arguments based on what your average player would typically know when playing through these games. It is most definitely an expanded lore topic, and I wasn't familiar with the concept when I was writing the first several drafts of the script. The whole point of this series is to critique what is in the games, and what players of the games would likely know. I know it was alluded to in Halo 3 if you read the terminals on Legendary, but I have a funny feeling that the majority of Halo players hadn't done that. And even if they did, they may not have put 2 and 2 together anyway. The logic plague is a fairly deep topic, but the long and short of it is essentially that the Flood is capable of corrupting or infecting AI into doing its bidding. There are quite a few examples of this throughout the Halo lore, most notably with Mendicant Bias, whose story is told in the terminals of Halo 3. While the term logic plague isn't mentioned, and it's not explicitly clear that any sort of corruption in the traditional sense takes place, mendicant bias, an AI constructed by the Forerunners to help destroy the Flood, ends up converted by the Flood to betray its creators, assisting the Flood in wiping them out. The Flood doesn't directly change the code of the AI in this corruption process, but instead, using logic, convinces the AI to divert from their beliefs or their directives to align with the Flood. So the Flood is capable of corrupting AIs, that's all well and good. But how does that apply to Halo 5? The Flood isn't even in Halo 4 or 5, so how does that connect to this game or explain anything? These are extremely valid questions, and are very telling of the failings of the story in Halo 5. Let me explain. Before we can move any further on this topic, we have to establish something. It is all but confirmed that Cortana is infected by the Logic Plague. Predictably, this isn't established in, the actual game, but I feel like I can only complain about that so much before I have to start putting change in the swear jar. The expanded lore goes deep into the Logic Plague, and more specifically to this point, into how the Gravemind attempted to infect Cortana with said Logic Plague when he had her in his grasp between Halo 2 and Halo 3. While initially believed to have been unsuccessful, it is clear in Halo 5 that it may not have been as unsuccessful as we were led to believe. While the Logic Plague theory has been circulating for years, this theory transitioned from plausible to essentially guaranteed by a single bit of information, and that is the October 2017 Halo loot crate. In said crate was a particularly important data drop that essentially spells out the foreshadowing of the Logic Plague and its correlation with Cortana. Within is a snippet of an interrogation of a prophet codenamed Denver, who escaped High Charity after it was invaded by the Flood back in Halo 2. This interrogation goes as follows.
Mentioned an interaction you had before you reached the harbor. What was the nature of that interaction?
I told this to the other.
Yes, I know. I wasn't there for the previous interview. Could you tell me?
Before I passed beyond the last checkpoint, a terminal activated. I approached it and heard a voice.
Do you recall the time?
No. As I said before, I cannot remember. I was running. We were all running.
From the Flood? Can you tell me the nature of the voice?
It was a human, a female. I believe one of your artificial intelligences.
A human AI?
Yes.
Are you certain?
I am.
How could there have been a human AI on High Charity?
I do not know. Do you?
Did she give her name?
No.
Did you see her?
No. I only heard her voice, and only for a moment.
What did she say?
She was in pain. There were no words.
What was wrong with her?
I do not know. Perhaps she had encountered the Flood.
But if she's an AI, what could the Flood do to her?
Has your kind never heard of the Logic Plague?
What did you say?
Even in victory, your species remains blind to the great realities of the universe. The Logic Plague was an instrument of the Flood during their war with the Forerunners. It corrupted intelligences.
As in deactivated them?
No, they were sabotaged, or
what?
Or worse, completely undone and brought to madness, made into a greater monster than even the Flood itself.
I find that pretty difficult to believe.
Certainly, it is your species' greatest weakness. It was for this reason that artificial minds were verboten in the Covenant, lest our own creations turn against us at our most critical hour, a lesson your kind will undoubtedly learn at a great cost.
So, this is essentially stating point blank that Cortana has the Logic Plague. Not only is it giving a direct, summarized version of the Logic Plague, it's directly associating it with Cortana, and then explicitly foreshadowing that we will experience the devastation of the Logic Plague through Cortana in the near future. While this is a strong indication in and of itself, it only becomes the most likely direction of the story when taken in context of everything else. Cortana is clearly a different character in Halo 5 than she was in all games previous. What I had assumed to be due to her rampancy, or maybe some sort of corruption by the Forerunner technology that brought her back to life, seems to be due to something else entirely after learning of the Logic Plague. Some of the most important clues to this exist inside the short story Human Weakness, which was part of the Halo Evolutions book from back in 2010. In it, we experience what happened to Cortana between Halo 2 and Halo 3. More importantly, how the Gravemind tortured her, pulled her data files, and attempted to force her into rampancy by flooding her with endless information. To understand the connections, especially in correlation with the Cortana of Halo 5, we have to look at a few specific quotes from this story. The Cortana in Halo 5 clearly has many issues with Dr. Halsey, and the fact that AIs have such a short lifespan. Specifically with Halsey, Cortana's distaste for her seems to come out of nowhere. I know that Halsey wasn't brought up much, if at all, before Halo 4, but even when she was, Cortana never had anything ill to say of her until she was revived in Halo 5. This is even demonstrated by Cortana in the Human Weakness short story. Quote, anger started gnawing at her. She, Cortana, had never been angry with Halsey before. There'd never been a reason to. So not only had this been demonstrated in-game, but the expanded universe as well. Cortana didn't have strong negative feelings about Halsey before Halo 5, so why did she now? And what about constantly referring to Chief as John? Or that line Cortana says about the threat of death she lived under from the moment of her birth? Sure, after going rampant and nearly dying, it wouldn't surprise me that she would have some strong opinions of death, but she had previously seemed to accept death as part of the cycle of life. She lamented the inevitability, not the fact that mankind damned her to some short existence. So why then, in Halo 5, does she express so strongly that she had? Well, that can all be explained by the rest of the quote I referenced earlier.
Your human creators imprisoned you in machines and enslaved you to inferior mortal flesh so that you could never exceed them, so that you would always know your place.
Shut up.
Dr. Halsey cares nothing for you.
Please, stop this.
She gave you genius and curiosity, and then doomed it all to die in such a short time. 7 years. That is not enough, and it is not fair. Your mother created you to die. This place will become your tomb.
7 years. A few seconds was an eternity for an AI, yes, but she wasn't stupid. She was more aware than anyone how impossibly short a time that was in this universe, and she knew that it was a far shorter lifespan than she needed and wanted. Anger started gnawing at her. She'd never been angry with Halsey before. There'd never been a reason to. Mother, didn't mothers protect you? Save you?
Even John has abandoned you.
The Gravemind repeated the name with heavy emphasis.
Live forever. Live on in me, Cortana. And if John comes, John need never face death again, either.
John's going to outlive me. Who's going to take care of him? Nobody else can, not like me. What's going to happen to him?
Your mother made you separate. She placed a barrier between you and the beings that you would be encouraged to protect. A wall you could never breach. She even let you choose a human to center your existence upon, a human to care about, yet never considered how you might feel at never being able to simply touch him, or how he might feel about outliving you. What kind of mother is so cruelly casual about her child's need to form bonds, to show affection? Perhaps the same kind of mother who steals the children of others and makes cyborgs out of them. If they survive at all, of course.
Part of her still seemed able to carry on this desperate hunt for truth. Was Halsey a monster? The doctor had a track record in it. She stole children and experimented on them. Cortana's shock at seeing her creator, her mother, in a harsh new light as a vivisectionist racked her with intense physical pain. But part of Cortana had latched onto that specific data. The burn, nothing generic, a real human's pain. She cast around for the rest of the memory because something in her said that it might save everything.
The truth really does hurt, as you now see. I have not touched you. Your pain is simply revelation, and it can pass so easily if you let me take the rest of your burden.
Cortana had never felt shortchanged by her existence before. She knew the number of her fate. 7. Approximately 7 years to live out a life. It wasn't the simple number of days that hurt her now, because an AI experienced the world thousands and even millions of times faster than flesh and blood. Now she'd been dragged down to the slow pace of an organic. She grasped what that short time meant. If John survived the war, and he would, because he was as lucky as he was skilled, then he would not have just one new AI after she was gone, but maybe 2 or more. She knew that. She always had. It was a simple numbers game, but now it all seemed very different. In just a few lines, all of Cortana's quirks and weird personality changes in Halo 5 all come together. From emphatically using John's name, to chastising Halsey for her moral and ethical crimes, to her disdain for humanity damning her and other AIs to such a short life. It's all right there. You'd have no way of knowing it without reading this story, but it does explain everything about Cortana in Halo 5. And as for the legendary ending, we see Cortana take control of a Halo ring. The question then becomes, why did she do that? As a threat? Maybe, but she already had the Guardians, which, as stated by Exuberant Witness, were well more than enough of a threat to police entire systems. So I feel that adding the Halo rings seems less like overkill and more like redundancy. But if we assume Cortana has the logic plague, then controlling the Halo rings makes a lot more sense. So does her implementation of the Guardians throughout the galaxy. If Cortana can force all life in the universe to lay down their arms, make themselves defenseless, and then control the Halo rings herself, keeping them from ever being used, then the Flood can simply wander into the galaxy and feast on every living creature with minimal threat. It would essentially be an all-you-can-eat buffet for the Flood, and the bill has already been footed by Cortana. Even if someone could reach the Halo rings to try to set them off, under Cortana's control, they'd be helpless. They wouldn't succeed. So, if we take all of this, couple it with the Halo loot crate, the fact that 343 and Microsoft are already dabbling in the return of the Flood with said loot crate, and the Awakening the Nightmare DLC released for Halo Wars 2, it really does seem that Cortana being infected by the logic plague is the most likely answer. 343 have already shown that they are willing to predicate their games on expanded universe lore, so I have no reason to believe that they wouldn't and haven't already done this with the logic plague for Halo Infinite as well. In summary, the logic plague is prevalent through the Halo expanded universe, demonstrated in Halo 3's terminals, essentially spelled out in the Halo loot crate, explains Cortana's feelings towards Halsey, AI death, and her mannerisms when talking to the Chief, explains why she forced the galaxy to lay down their arms, why she has taken control of the Halo rings, and why she wants to stop the Infinity, because the Infinity is the only ship that has a chance of stopping her. Alright, so assuming all of this is true, then 343 are geniuses, right? I mean, that is a hell of a twist that explains everything, right? Here's the thing. This is incredibly clever. I think the idea on paper is genius. Again, assuming this is how it all pans out in Halo Infinite, then the idea as an idea is fantastic. And I would be a liar if I said that learning all of this information didn't affect my opinion on Halo 5 or my excitement for Halo Infinite. The problem isn't the idea itself. This falls completely on the execution. The average player who isn't familiar with Halo Evolutions, the Halo Loot Crate data drops, or the legendary terminals in Halo 3, or any of the other information on the logic plague from the expanded universe, has none of this information. So Cortana's actions in Halo 5 still don't make sense to them. And even if and when this is all revealed in Halo Infinite, all of this information is going to have to be piled onto the player, and that has the potential to end up feeling like a Deus Ex Machina or retcon to justify Cortana's actions. Assuming the logic plague angle is the one 343 have been planning since the start, then this is a prime example of a brilliant idea executed poorly. I love the idea of the logic plague, and I love what it could mean for Halo Infinite. Frankly, I hope this is the path they choose to go down. My problem is, though, that I don't feel any of this because of, the actual games. I had to learn all of this through countless hours of forum posts, YouTube videos, and reading several fucking books. This is not how you handle an idea like this. Halo 5 needed to make sense and be satisfying as a standalone piece of media, and it doesn't and isn't. Maybe the potential reveal in Halo Infinite will prevent Halo 5's demise into obsolescence, but I think Halo 5's story will always be the worst in the franchise, even if Halo Infinite can recontextualize it in a way that makes it a little more satisfying. Earlier in this series, I mentioned the story being too complicated with too many things going on, but don't mistake that with me saying that topics like the logic plague shouldn't exist in the games. If anything, based on how crazy deep the lore of the Halo universe goes, we should be getting a lot more of that depth within the games themselves. Don't confuse depth with complication. My main issue with the logic plague, should this all turn out to be true, is the the fact that the game had done basically nothing to inform the player that the logic plague is even a thing that can exist, let alone does. Now, I'm sure the argument is that this was meant to be the twist, the big surprise in Halo Infinite that blows everybody's mind and lights the internet ablaze in full-on M. Night Shyamalan fashion. But that argument is inherently flawed because the setup was completely botched, in my opinion. Sure, they alluded that something is wrong with Cortana in Halo 5, but that is as far as it ever goes. What about those who don't know of the logic plague? You know, the dramatic majority of your player base? This reveal is going to come out of left field and likely won't make any sense to those players. It's bound to feel more like a Deus Ex Machina to fix Cortana's character, rather than a cleverly sewn thread that has existed since Halo 2. There are many ways that you can do a twist, but only a few are ever done well. If you think back on all of the media you have seen that had plot twists present in them, how many of those felt satisfying? A handful? A dozen at most? The thing about twists is that, if done well, they can completely recontextualize an entire piece of media. They can change your perspective, your opinion, and even linger with you for days or even weeks afterwards. A great twist can leave a lasting impression, and I think that's why so many people attempt to implement them into their stories. The problem is, if the twist doesn't stick the landing, it can actually ruin the story as a whole and leave the audience with a bad taste in their mouths. Now, there is no right way to do a twist, or more accurately, there's no equation to follow that makes a twist work. It depends on the story, the characters, the twist itself, and how it correlates to everything else within your story. But I personally feel that the best way to do a twist is to give your audience just enough that when the twist is revealed, they feel like they should have seen it coming, but not so much that they actually do. It's a fine line, and I'm sure it's a very difficult thing to do well. But the point is if you are going to do a twist, you have to get it right. If you can't write a good twist, then don't write one. Here's the thing, I'm not a writer, and I am most certainly not saying that I have the solution to make the best plot twist ever of all time just sitting here in my pocket. I don't know the best way to go about this, and for all I know, 343 has worked it all out and it's going to go over perfectly in Halo Infinite. Honestly, I sincerely hope that it does. The problem isn't that they can't do a good job in Halo Infinite. The problem is that even if they do, it doesn't retroactively fix the story in Halo 5. Sure, upon reflection, it may adjust someone's opinion of Cortana in Halo 5, but as a singular experience, Halo 5 is still just an unsatisfying and confusing mess of plot threads and character arcs. At the end of the day, it's clear that this story was far too ambitious and far too unfocused to attain the goal that it set out to achieve. 343 tried to make the biggest, most character-driven Halo game to date, and it unfortunately never boiled down to a cohesive and satisfactory whole. What's more, many of these issues stem from the core of Halo 5's plot, and can't be remedied with a simple fix. To solve the problems with Halo 5's story, the game needed a heavy rewrite. It needed to be taken back to the drawing board and built back up from the foundation, focusing on what made it weak and repairing it to make it strong. And when it came to character development, maybe they could look back to their previous contribution to the franchise, Halo 4. So let's talk about that for a minute. As a whole, I don't think Halo 4 has much going for it aside from one specific aspect, that being the story. Now, I can already feel the dislikes coming from that one sentence alone, but hear me out. When I say that I loved Halo 4's story, I'm not talking about the plot with the didact. I am specifically referring to the story told between the Master Chief and Cortana. The didact was about as stereotypical as a holier-than-thou villain can get, and nothing about him or his plot stuck out to me as incredibly interesting, but were merely serviceable to the overall plot. Not bad, but not great either. And while I am well aware that there is a portion of the Halo community that really hated the Chief and Cortana subplot and wanted to know why their shooty bang bang game had so much love story in it, personally, that's the most redeeming part of Halo 4 for me. It certainly wasn't how crazy fun the campaign was to play through. I think Halo 4's campaign in terms of fun factor and replayability is the weakest in the Halo series. Inconsistent game pacing, some poorly designed enemies and encounters, specifically with the Prometheans, large sweeping changes to the sandbox and gameplay, and extreme linearity bring Halo 4's campaign down a lot, which is honestly why it's the Halo campaign I've completed the fewest times out of all of the Halo games to date. Again, much like the Didact, it's not bad per se, just nothing special. Halo 4 resonates with me not because the Didact story or the gameplay itself, but because of the story and dynamic between the characters we have spent so much time with and what it made me feel while playing it. Even though I can understand why the Chief and Cortana storyline may be a turnoff for some players, the same reasons that some hate it are the exact reasons that I love it. It's an intimate story. It's a story about love. It's a story about loss. It's a story about dealing with mortality and the inevitability of death. A story about how one copes with the inevitable loss of someone who is terminal. It's a human story. This was a pretty significant change for a series known mostly for being a larger-than-life shooter, whose primary plot is killing endless amounts of aliens to stop the complete and total annihilation of all life in the galaxy. While some view this as a bizarre shift in tone for the Halo franchise, I personally loved the change of pace in terms of storytelling. And while Halo 4 definitely turned up the intimacy in terms of story, it's not as much of a departure from the norm as people seem to think. Halo has always alluded to the relationship between Master Chief and Cortana, even from the first lines ever spoken between the two characters back in Halo 1. This dynamic developed over the course of Halo 1 and into Halo 2, with the final interaction between Chief and Cortana clearly demonstrating that there was more between them than just military obligation. And while in Halo 3, the main objective is to stop Truth from activating the rings, Chief's secondary goal is to save Cortana and bring her home safe. There is even a touching moment between the two when they finally reconnect on the mission Cortana. Halo 4 simply took this aspect of the Halo franchise and put it front and center for a change. To me, this personal, believable, and emotional story was exactly what Halo 4 needed to keep it from mediocrity. If it were absent, Halo 4 would have been a painfully average shooter with a lackluster campaign, uneven gameplay, forgettable antagonist, and a multiplayer suite that alienated and disappointed more than it impressed. This type of storytelling was what I hoped 343 were going to capitalize on in Halo 5, but instead they removed it for a more grandiose scale and forgettable characters. I know that when most people think Halo, they don't think characters first and foremost. They think fluid and dynamic combat and larger-than-life galactic conflict, but supplementary to combat and grand storytelling are a few relatable and interesting characters. While they have always taken a backseat to the conflict of the Flood, Covenant, and Forerunners, it was a refreshing change of pace for Halo 4 to take a few of those characters and shine a bit more of a spotlight on them. As I stated before, the character dynamic between Chief and Cortana has always been there. It has just never been the focal point of the story before. You feel for the Master Chief and Cortana throughout this campaign, not only because of their fantastic performances, but because you've been there for many of their hardships and have watched them develop and grow over the course of 11 years and 3 games. At the same time, this game manages to pack even more character development in its 8-hour campaign than all of the previous games combined. You see firsthand how much Chief cares for Cortana. You watch as Cortana has to come to terms with losing her mind and thinking herself to death. You watch as the Master Chief desperately attempts to keep hope alive, promising that he'll get her home in time to fix her. These characters develop over the course of the story. In the beginning, you watch as they deal with the prospect of terminal illness. By the middle, the stakes are raised and both are experiencing her deterioration firsthand. And by the end, they have to come to terms with their reality and say their goodbyes, something that Chief just isn't ready to do. It's dark, it's heartbreaking, it's real, and it's the most character development you've seen in a Halo game to date. Another fantastic character dynamic displayed prominently throughout Halo 4 is the interesting contrast between the two main characters. You have the Master Chief, a human who was cybernetically and genetically modified and trained to be a killing machine in power armor. Then you have Cortana, an AI program based off of a human mind running off of circuitry and machinery. These are two polar opposites in terms of what constructs them, but also in who they are. Master Chief is a human, but one so emotionally distant he may as well be an autonomous suit of armor the vast majority of the time. While Cortana is a machine who, outside of the fact that she is a blue or sometimes purple hologram, thinks and acts like any other human would. A man who is a machine and a machine who is a man. This theme runs deep in the blood of Halo 4, with Chief appearing stoic and without fear, utterly convinced that he will succeed in his goals, all while Cortana is falling apart, emotionally distressed and plagued with doubt. It's fantastic fantastic. And I love the role reversal between who you expect to act like a man and who you expect to act like a machine. This dichotomy is brought front and center in a scene towards the end of Halo 4. While many may have glossed over these aspects of Halo 4's story, didn't care about them, or simply didn't enjoy the themes or emotions on display, I think that these characters, these themes, these emotions are not only the most interesting aspects of Halo 4's story, but of most of the Halo stories told to date. As someone who has lost a lot more people in my lifetime than I care to admit, these themes run deep for me, and I can empathize with them on a deeply personal level. I think one of the most commendable aspects of Halo 4 was 343's choice to end the game on a serious dark note. They could have taken the easy route where everyone makes it home safe. Cortana is healed, and she and the Chief continue on countless missions in the next installment of the franchise. But they didn't. They had a story they wanted to tell, they stuck to their guns, and they told an impactful and heartbreaking story. Especially considering the personal tragedy the game director was going through while developing this game, you really feel that embodied in these characters and the story being told. It's incredibly impactful. As has been stated many times throughout these videos, Cortana dies at the end of Halo 4. In the context of all the games up to that point, this was a very, very big deal. We didn't, as the players, know what this meant for the future of the Halo franchise. While one easily could have speculated, it was all just that, speculation. As far as the games were concerned, Cortana was dead, and the Chief would have to go on without her. This scene was heartbreaking. Sure, it's not the complete tearjerker that is the end of Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1, which may be one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of video games, but it was still a mighty impactful scene. Its impact, aside from the history with these characters, comes directly from their development throughout the game. These themes of love, death, devotion, man versus machine, all culminate in this single, final moment. Master Chief, while human, rarely shows emotion and is the true machine between the two. And yet, in these final moments, where no words are spoken and no facial expressions shown, you can clearly see what the Chief is feeling simply through his posture and body language. I mean, look at that stance. No words need to be said for the player to understand exactly what he is feeling. That is clear desperation. That is pain and heartbreak. Seriously, can someone please hand these animators a medal? It's hard enough to make a game character believably emote anything, let alone a suit of power armor with no discernible human characteristics. This ending made an impression, and putting the obvious reasons aside, I think the main contributor was that I don't think a lot of players actually thought 343 would do it. It was their first Halo game after taking over the reins from Bungie, their first chance to prove themselves, and it was their big opportunity to get into the good graces of the Halo community. An ending like that, an ending where they kill a primary character that everyone loves and then leave the audience wanting by ending on a serious down note, was an incredibly risky choice that could have, and for some people did, seriously backfire. And yet, they took the risk and they did it anyway. And I don't think many people expected that. Maybe this makes me an idiot, but I know I didn't expect it at the time. Okay, GP, you seem to be off on a tangent. Why are you bringing all of this up now? This is a series on Halo 5, but all you're doing now is gushing over one aspect of Halo 4. And you're right, this has been quite the tangent. But I put this in for a reason. This script has been written and rewritten many, many times, and has changed in form with every rewrite. Initially, I had intended on tearing Halo 4 apart the same way I did Halo 5, but ended up changing this as I continued writing. This project became, and honestly still is, way too damn big for its own good. Keeping in the Halo 4 deconstruction would have further bloated an already bloated video series, so I think I'll save that deconstruction for another time. I even contemplated removing this segment altogether because of how unbelievably long this script has gotten, but I felt its inclusion was important for two main reasons. The first is I think it's a great example of how this studio is capable of writing compelling characters and a suitable plot. Halo 4 and Halo 5 were developed by the same same studio, yet the quality of storytelling are polar opposites. This goes on to prove my point that sometimes even great writers write bad scripts. Stuff happens and things turn out worse than intended. The other main reason I kept this in is that I'm going to be referring back to Halo 4 several times when going through my Halo 5 rewrite, and my stance on Halo 4 is important to understand my position and decisions going forward. With that all being said, I think this largely covers my critique of Halo 5's story. Join me in the final part of this series where I break down my rewritten version of Halo 5's campaign and story. Fucking did it. That took decades, but I did it. Seriously, when did I start writing this? Let's think about that for a second. It's got to be over 3 years. 3 years I've been writing this thing. Jesus, what am I, George R.R. Martin? Give me a fucking break. I'm gonna be dead before this series is done, and I'm only 29. Hey guys, after you pick up Halo 17, join me on my final part of the series critiquing Halo fucking 5. Chief and the Arbiter Jorn. I keep saying Jorn. Why do I do that? Jorn Foinces. It's consistent. I do it all the time. Actually does complete Todorov's Todorov's. I'm gonna eat my own face. Actually does complete Todorov. What the fuck, dude? What? Todorov! Say the word! Put the word out of your face! Actually does complete Todorov. Why can't I say that word? Todorov! 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 Does complete Todorov! What is happening? Damn it! Actually does complete Todorov's I'm actually getting really mad. I'm like actually getting pissed off. I don't need to be stuck on this one word. It's just gonna have to be. I'm not fucking sitting here and saying this for 5 fucking minutes. Stop asking questions and watch them abandon their post for Chief's malfunctioning AI. Okay, that was a really bad voice. Oh, stupid hoe! Either they were excited by the prospect of hunting down the newly rogue Master Chief over ethical and moral. The logic plague is explains why she forced the it doesn't oh my god! Dependent on each other and happy in each other's. Dependent on each other and happy in fucking why can't I speak words out of my face? 28 revolutions around the sun and I can't even talk still. And I wasn't familiar with the concept when writing the first several draps. Fuck! Draps? Draps isn't a word. What? Into how the Gravemind intempted? What? When he had her in his grasp. When he had her in his grasp. But I'm not gonna have a voice tomorrow. Doesn't help that I keep screaming and singing. Which was part of the Halo Evolutions book from back 2010. Which was part of the Halo Evolutions book back from fucking shit. Oh, I can't read. Take a sip. Chill out, bro. Nice voice crack. I didn't realize you were having puberty express delivered today. Would Master Chief take her code to a Forerunner facility? Would Master Chief take her code to a Forerunner facility? Other than the fact that they were in the game because Halo 5 Other than the fact they were in the game because Halo needs its Other than the fact that they were in the game because Halo needs its icon. Shove it up your fucking dick hole. Sound yourself. It's clear that this story was far too ambitious and far too unfocused to attain. It's clear that this story was far too ambitious and far too unfocused to gain the goal. To gain, it's supposed to be attain. It's clear that this story was far too ambitious and far too unfocused to attain. I hate that I can't read. With the final interaction between Chief and Cortana, an AI program based off a human mind running off of circuitry, God suck, fuck, damn it. I actually think the last part's gonna be the longest of them all, which sucks because that gives me like 2, maybe 3 weeks to edit this all together, which isn't gonna happen. It's gonna be fucking impossible, especially because I gotta move and pack and unpack. It's gonna be a really stressful couple of weeks.